Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Liz Busby. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy, a reviewer of books, and a Latter-day Saint. And with me today is my co-host, Carl.
Hello, everyone. Good to be back. I am a scholar of religion who has written on the intersection of religious themes and pop culture, and I enjoy hanging out here on this podcast and talking about cool movies. So here we are.
And with us today, we also have Amanda.
Hi, I am Amanda. I'm a writer and a former teacher, and I'm the director of a Facebook group called Uplift Community of Faith, and we are a faith crisis support group.
And our other guest today, whose essay we're going to be discussing, is Chris. Introduce yourself, Chris.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris. I am a PhD student at the University of Iowa studying film studies.
Awesome. And we're going to talk a little bit about Chris's work today. But first, we're going to start with our best books segment, where we all recommend something that we're watching, reading, or listening to. My recommendation today is a podcast. It's called This is the Gospel, and it's a podcast by LDS Living, which, might be a little cheesy, but I think this one's a really good podcast because it is a storytelling podcast. A lot of the Mormon podcasts tend to be come follow me podcasts or interview podcasts. And I just started listening to this one, and I like that they find interesting stories and tell the whole story, kind of this American lifestyle, where they tell a whole story and it has a theme and they think about it. So very well produced podcast, highly recommended. Carl, you want to go next?
So I've talked before about how I am working my way through NPR's Top 100 Science Fiction and Fantasy Novels, and one of the ones that I read a long time ago was the first book in the Outlander series. And I felt like I'd been snookered a little bit by it, because it felt like it was mostly a romance novel with a little bit of historical fiction and one science fiction element of time travel. But I recently got into listening to the sequels to it, and there's still some parts that I have to skip with the romance thing, but it's become a lot more interesting in sort of the how would a modern person deal with living in a time and a culture very different from our own, and I'm enjoying it more than I kind of expected to based on my reaction to the first book. So I'm going to, with the caveat of there's some stuff you're going to have to skip, recommend the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon.
Awesome. Amanda, have you got something to recommend for us today?
Sure. So I'm always reading a lot of things at once, but since we're talking on the topic of faith crisis tonight, I'm rereading The Brothers Karamazov. It's been many years since I've read this book, and I am slowly creeping through it because it is very long. But I do love Dostoevsky, especially in thinking about questions of faith and doubt, and particularly when he talks about nihilism and atheism, which tend to be uh, the questions that were involved in my faith crisis. So that's what I'm recommending tonight.
I have heard that book is excellent, and I still need to get around to it, so I better just pick it up and get started.
I feel like I've read the first 100 pages of that like 5 times and never gotten, because if you leave it for too many years, then you forget what happened. You have to start over. So
and you have to remind yourself all the Russian names. Who's that? And they all sound the same. And
it's a really lovely beginning. I would like to someday have read the rest.
It's like how everybody really knows First Nephi very, very well, but not the rest of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Chris, what have you got for us today?
I've got a nonfiction one, but it's about stories and fiction. It's called The Anthropocene Unconscious, Climate Catastrophe Culture by Mark Bold. Verso Press book. It's relatively short, and it's just this kind of analysis. I thought of it, it's kind of similar to my book that we're reading from today, in the sense that it takes a pet topic and kind of takes all these cultural texts and fits them to that topic, or asks in what ways do they speak to that topic. So it's going through all these films and shows and digging into how they are expressing this anxiety about this climatological crisis that we're going through right now, and how even if they're not films about climate change, they're secretly films about climate change. It's a really interesting book.
Well, that sounds really fascinating. I'd love to read that. Oh, my reading pile is always getting longer.
And it gets bigger faster than you check. If you're like me, it gets bigger faster than you check stuff off. So
sure, yeah.
I actually, every January, I go through and I trim down my Goodreads to be read list to under 100 books every year. But it still gets bigger every year. So, oh well. Someday.
I should probably do that.
Yes. So today we are here. We're going to talk about an essay that Chris wrote in a book that you edited, right? Called Mormonism and the Movies. I read this book a couple months back, and I just loved it. All the variety of approaches to Mormonism and film. So I thought we could start with Chris. Could you talk about how did this book come to be?
Sure. This book came to be on a whim, basically. I made a private Facebook post and tagged a bunch of friends of mine who I thought might be interested in such a project. And I said, this is a thing that I think should exist in the world. Do you guys want to make it with me? We could write essays. We could talk about the intersections between our religion, or our heritage, at least, in Mormonism, and the films and media that we all love. Because my group of friends has always been gathering to watch movies together and things. So we've always been having these long, critical conversations about how these films speak to various spiritual interests that we have, or how something that we talked about at church speaks to a film that we then watch that night, and these things are always talking to each other. So that was the general kind of through line or organizing principle. And I think that was 2015. Maybe 2014, 15 that I got that project off the ground. And it's a long journey, but between then and November of 2021, when it was finally published. But between 2015 and 2017, 18, most of the essays were written around that time. And then between 18 and 21 was just the publishing process. But yeah, it's just this anthology, this collection of different angles, different ways in which these writers have tackled that very vague prompt of what is the relationship between Mormonism and movies.
Yeah, and I enjoyed all the different kinds of essays that were in there, right? There were ones that talked about it from a filmmaker perspective or an actor perspective. There were ones going over different films for theological concerns, like how do we portray Jesus in film. And I really enjoyed, because I'm a lit crit person, I enjoyed the ones that were interpreting films through a Mormon lens, especially like they did Groundhog's Day and Kiki's Delivery Service, which are two of my favorite films. Super interesting. So highly recommend you guys pick up the book. But today we wanted to talk about your essay at the end of the book, which is called Three Approaches to Crisis. And you kind of go over using film as a way to approach faith crisis,
Right.
as a model, kind of. And we had Carl and Amanda also read this essay. What are you guys' general thoughts on this essay?
First of all, I was so excited that when I opened up the essay, I had seen all the films. I was really excited about that. So I had something to compare it to. And there are some of the films, which we'll get into later, I'm sure, that are definitely films that I would have also picked to represent talking about faith crisis. So I really appreciated a lot of your examples in terms of looking at different approaches.
I enjoyed it quite a bit. I always enjoy conversations of this nature, and they're so relevant and so sort of timely because of so many people who join large Facebook groups like Amanda's to talk about faith crises and stuff. And so it was good to sort of bring it down to a level and with some examples that I think most people are familiar with, although I had not seen every movie in your example, and added a couple to my movie list now that I need to check
Okay.
off. Although I do a better job of checking off movies that I want to watch than books. And I enjoyed the fact that you outlined 3 different approaches and then critiqued all 3 of them. At some point in the middle, I was like, "Oh, is he just gonna come like down really hard and say I'm in favor of option number 3?" But then you didn't, and I appreciated that because I am a nuance kind of guy. A black, most everything is shades of gray and not super black and white, and I really appreciated how you portrayed and showed the strengths and the weaknesses of the 3 different approaches that you thought these various films modeled for us.
I appreciate that. I'm glad it resonated with you guys. I have to say on a personal note that this book project started in probably February 2015, and it wasn't until a year or two later that I thought, oh no, we need we need an essay on crisis because I'm going through one, and most of the co-writers that I've enlisted in this project are going through one or have gone through one. And I mean, late 2015 was the exclusion policy leak, and that was a big moment of crisis for a lot of people, myself included. And so this book project kind of represents a time capsule part of my life, and this essay in particular represents um, a kind of urgent need that I felt to kind of add in something after many of the essays had already been written that spoke to this difficult thing that a lot of us face. So I'm glad you guys found things that resonated with you in it.
I would be curious to know how maybe you didn't pass it around to all the other co-authors from the various things, but if you were writing to speak to a moment in your own life as well as moments you saw in theirs, how did the essay
Mhm.
resonate with them? If you can give secondhand accounts of
Sure. Yeah, I'm trying to remember we had a lot of long conversations about all the essays in the book, and they're all kind of blending together. I think people were generally um, uh, heartened by the thing that you described, this kind of ambivalence or nuance, or like willing to sit with all 3 approaches and with all 3 of them having strengths and weaknesses, was something that I think several of my friends um, were refreshed to hear, because sometimes in my own rhetoric and a casual conversation, maybe I might be not so even handed, and I think there was a sense of people wanting to be seen, because the people who wrote for this book are from all sorts of varieties on any spectrum of faith or faith journey that you could imagine. And so I think people wanted to not be depicted unfairly, and I hope that they feel that they were depicted fairly, or that their approach was treated with some grace. Right. I clearly have biases that I think rereading it today, I'm like, oh yeah, that's coming on a little strong. That paragraph is like definitely putting my foot down on something. But I think that my friends who helped with the book were felt respected.
So I do want to get to these 3 approaches because I think that's the most
Sure.
intriguing part. But I think we should start by kind of defining our terms here. What is a faith crisis, and how is it different from just having questions or having a tough year or whatever?
Mm.
And that's kind of where you start the essay too, like defining what is a faith crisis and how is it different. What do you guys thoughts?
Well, so I think um, what distinguishes a faith crisis from having questions is um, generally when we talk about a faith crisis, we're talking about something that kind of has an impact on our everyday life that is kind of more all consuming. Sometimes it creates significant anxiety. Um, uh, it's not just, oh, I read this thing, or I found this um, I found out this information about history and I don't really know what to do with it, but it kind of causes you to question not only some of the things that you believe, but the big implications for those things that you believe, and the choices that you've made in your life in the past, and how those were influenced by your belief in the gospel, and your choices in the future, and if my belief changes, is that going to impact my choices in the future, and maybe I should do things differently than I thought I should have. And so it kind of is, it's an experience that can shift your framework of how you view your life.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be really destabilizing. I really like the way you described that um, all-encompassingness of the difficulties that it introduces, right? Because to go back to this comparison, Liz, of like faith crisis versus just having questions. A question, I think of like the metaphor of like a fork in the road. It's like, yeah, maybe that fork in the road is a difficult choice, right? Maybe when you encounter um, a question or a decision that's hard, um, it might be agonizing. But a faith crisis is less like a road and more like the whole ground underneath your feet has shifted or threatens to give out entirely, right? It's destabilizing. It's frightening. It uh, seems at first glance or when it first emerges to not have a resolution. It's whereas a fork in the road, you know that it might be a hard choice, but sooner or later I'm going to go down one of these roads, right? Um, I
Right.
think
And you
when
have the
you're
option to,
yeah
oh, I made a mistake, turn around and go back. It's not like, it doesn't
yeah
feel like such a life or death decision that you're not going to be able to take back.
yeah yeah
Yeah. I
I think, sorry, I think one thing that I would add is, it comes about in different ways for so many different people. I think we hear probably maybe a disproportionate amount about, I found this history thing and it shook my faith. But there are a lot of other, and then perhaps from faithful people, we kind of sometimes hear the well-meaning but not necessarily accurate, well, it's just coming from making bad choices, um, but
huh.
or wanting to sin. But it can come from a variety of experiences. It can come from one major event, some sort of life-altering event that causes you to question. For some people, it comes like at crucial, like developmental life stages. Like, I think you see a lot of people, especially now, experiencing faith crises in their sort of transition between, like, the late adolescent, young college kind of age to the adults, family, married, that kind of initial independent stage in life. A lot of people. So sometimes it has to do with like our life development. Sometimes it does have to do with historical issues. Sometimes it has to do with social or political issues. And it can be one thing or a whole series of different things that can come together to cause that.
I don't feel that I have a whole bunch to add to what has been said so far about the definition of faith crisis. Seems like the basic point is that we all sort of grow and evolve, and our faith changes a little bit over time, and that's natural, and that's part of the human experience. And you know, Paul's, when I was a child, I thought and spake as a child, but now that I'm grown, I should put away childish things. That's just, we all expect that to happen. But for me, I haven't really had a serious faith crisis. I did once on my mission for a day, and it absolutely sucked.
mm,
But the Chris's point that it creates an entire paradigm shift is accurate, because I was kind of at the point sitting there in my apartment on my mission, sitting there thinking like, do I need to leave the church and go, like, right now, go start attending this Pentecostal church here in the Bronx, New York,
mm,
because this interpretation of the Bible I find so convincing right now. Uh, and that lasted until I realized a little bit of the theological implications of what they were talking about, and then it went away in an instant. But for that day, it was terrible because it made me want to completely change the trajectory of my life. And
mm.
so I think that is a good definition of faith crisis. When you run into something that to reintegrate into your life requires more than just the natural evolution and growth that we all experience as humans.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think it's super important that those of us, especially in the church, who haven't experienced this kind of faith crisis, are really careful when we're talking to other people who are going through a faith crisis. Um, Something that might like seem not a big deal to you or easy or obvious to you might not be that way to someone else, and you might not have the same background as them that is causing this destabilization. It's not like something objective.
Yeah.
It is like a very personal experience. And so I think the least helpful thing we can do is to say that someone else's worries are stupid or caused by sin or just put it on a shelf, those kinds of things. This made me think I'm always bringing up C.S. Lewis, so I got to bring in the C.S. Lewis quote. But he has this quote about I have a reluctance to say much about temptations to which I myself am not exposed. So I feel like it's really important that if you haven't experienced a faith crisis, you're very careful in counseling people who are experiencing a faith crisis because you don't know what it's like if it's always been easy for you. So I think we should all keep that in mind as we're talking to friends and family who might be going through these things. And that's why I think groups like Amanda's are very helpful, where you can talk to other people and work through these things. So,
Yeah. Well, and to underline another reason why it's fraught and difficult, and why I think, Liz, your advice to members who haven't gone through this to maybe not presume things is so important, is because to underline something Amanda pointed out, like everyone's faith crisis looks a little different, manifests in different ways, and I think part of what makes that so profound in Mormonism or in LDS kind of like culture is that if you ask any, if you take a random sampling of people who identify as LDS and ask them what is your relationship to Mormonism, they're all going to have a different answer. And so if all of those people in that sample go through a crisis, their crisis is going to look different because the crisis is affecting a different thing that means a different thing to them, right? For some people, their experience with Mormonism is mostly about the doctrinal, or about the social, or about the institution as a organization that does good, and those are three different things that could go into crisis, right? The doctrinal foundation could fall apart, the historical understanding could fall apart, the social underpinnings or trust in the people around you at church could fall apart, or your trust in whether the institution is helping or harming people could fall apart, and those all feel different and they all manifest differently. And to presume to have a pat answer to what it means to go through one, or what the solution should be, I think fails to recognize the complexity of what people's relationship to their faith tradition can look like, right?
yeah, and so that's why I enjoyed the use of film in your essay to like look at a faith crisis kind of at a step removed. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like stories are a very good way that we train our brain to think about things in a more safe environment, right? Like these are not issues that really are going to affect me when the movie's over. It's over. Um, but it can help us think through how to deal with these things. So I think using film as a tool for talking about how to deal with these things is very helpful, and maybe could be a way that people can approach those in their life without attacking or like not understanding, like using this language of a story to discuss it in a more safe way. So let's go to the first of the three approaches then. I'm super excited about this. So the first one you called Doubt Your Doubts,
Mm-hmm.
which I believe we can all recognize the Uchtdorf talk that came from, but he was quoting someone else, right?
Right.
Who was it you said in this essay? I can't find it. Um,
I'm also blanking on that citation.
let's see. It looks like Pentecostals are coming up again. Here we go. F.F. Bosworth.
Bosworth, right?
There you go. In a book called Christ the Healer, which, general authorities are known to read other religious books and pull in good quotes. So truth is truth. Um, but yeah, so let's talk about the films that you listed under here for this concept of doubting your doubts as a way to deal with a faith crisis. Does anybody have a favorite one that was in that section that they want to talk about?
Well, I was interested in the Life of Pi comparison and
Mm.
talking about, I can't remember the term that you used, Chris. I had to look up the words, but the idea that you pick what you want to believe. What
Right.
is it that you
Doxastic
want to?
voluntarism. Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is something that I have heard. I have heard it from people who have not gone through a faith crisis, and from people who have. You ultimately get to choose what you believe. And I remember hearing that and just thinking, man, I don't want to choose. I don't want to believe what sounds nice. I want to believe what's actually true. And I
Mm.
don't know to what extent other people experience that. But I know that was something that I did hear quite often was, um, what you ultimately get to choose. Faith is a choice, and that was a really hard one for me to hear. Now, looking back on it, I do have some agreement with that statement, actually. But man, was that the thing that I hated to hear the most.
Mm.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that
Oh, go ahead.
scene in Life of Pi is super powerful, right? Where he's like, well, you could believe that version, or you could believe this version, and then gives us this whole horrific version that we didn't realize wasn't just this funny story about a kid and a tiger making it across the ocean.
Yeah.
And then it makes you realize as a viewer why he would choose to believe this unbelievable version instead.
Yeah. It boils belief down to this sense of preference, right? Um, and with all of our comments so far, we're being pretty hard on, I think, this approach, and I think for reasons that are justified. And my biases, I'll just show my cards that I'm very I have a hard time with this approach, and I think it's for all the reasons you guys just said, that when you find something unbelievable, to be told that you can just choose to believe it feels absurd. It feels like someone's morally judging something that's incredulous to you, right? Which is not something that you really have. You don't have power over looking at 2 plus 2 and deciding that it's actually 5 if that doesn't line up with anything that you understand. Um, you only have power to believe what seems believable to you based on all sorts of factors, right, including your traumas, your experiences, your knowledge, your study, whatever. So to be told, well, why don't you just pick the better story, feels almost like an insult. But I do want to, a caveat to all of this hesitation that we're expressing is that there is some strength, I think, in um, the humility required to set aside, to go back to that quote of doubt your doubts, to set aside the things that seem unbelievable and to be able to lean in on something that you find valuable despite it being maybe unbelievable, right? I think there is value in that, or there is something profound in that ability in certain contexts, right? Which is not to say that I think this is necessarily the best approach to a faith crisis, but I do think that people who lean on this approach are doing it for reasons that make sense to them, right? They're doing it because um, to them it's a way to show their strength. It's a way to show God that they are devoted. It's a way to express something that matters. And I don't think anyone is willfully um, choosing ignorance because they want to be ignorant. I think people are
Right.
choosing a belief in something that they can't wrap their head around because it gives them peace, or because it gives them the strength to deal with an adversity, or because it gives them a relationship that they find meaningful. There's all sorts of complicated reasons that people
Yeah, and I like that the movie pointed this out. It's not that like Pi is denying the reality of what happened. It's just that believing this version of it makes it easier for him to live with what happened. It works better with the life that he wants to live, even though he knows this one maybe could be more true.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's that choice of something you can live with in spite of truth, maybe
Yeah.
even
Yeah. Yeah.
in spite of logic. Let's say not truth, since
Yeah.
Truth
I'd
is a
like
messy
to
word. Yeah, it's a good.
Sure. I'd like to push back a little bit against all the naysaying on this, because part of the doubt your doubts thing that I really appreciate, and this goes back to your original question, like which of the movies that Chris brought up in the essay did you like the most? Contact is one of my all-time favorite
I was
Mhm.
going
science
to say,
fiction movies. It is like hard science fiction with sort of the spiritualism of science that Carl Sagan was so good at doing, all wrapped up with some fantastic acting, and it's a marvelous movie. But doubting your doubts is, and you touched on this briefly, Chris, but is
Mhm.
just a recognition of the humility we should all have, that we are just dumb humans who don't understand lots of stuff with our
Yeah.
myopic points of view. And so even in the movie, when after Dr. Arroway has gone through the machine, and she had this experience where she went through all these wormhole tunnels and ended up talking to an alien looked like her dad on Pensacola, Florida beach, and she's there in
Yeah.
front of the Senate committee, and they're like, and you don't have any evidence for that. And she's like, no, and I might have even hallucinated the whole thing, but I don't think I did. And
Right.
I love in that moment, because she is trying to grapple with the data she has available, but recognizes her own fallibility in that moment. And that is also part. Doubt your doubts doesn't have to be just soldier on through and you'll get there. It can also be
Right.
take a moment and be humble about what you know and what you don't know. And that is also, I think, an important, I would hope that would be an important part of everybody's study of their faith. And so that's why I really like Dr. Arroway, the scientist who is aware of her limitations. And she's a great
Yeah.
character for that reason, among many others.
Yeah.
This
And
reminds
her.
me of
Oh, go
a
ahead.
piece of advice I read online. I think it was an advice columnist. I picked up a bad habit of reading advice columns during the pandemic because, like, that's what I did to cope. But this was to an atheist couple who was having trouble dealing with their religious family and, like, having trouble respecting them because of their beliefs. And the statement that this person made was, you need to remember as an atheist that there are people who are much smarter than you who still believe in religion. And I think the reverse applies as well to religious people. Like, religious people need to remember there are people much smarter than you who are atheists or agnostic and don't believe in God. So it's not a matter of who is the smartest finds the truth.
Yeah.
It's more difficult and more complex than that, and we can't just reduce it to, well, I'm smarter than you and I know that this is not true or is
Right.
true.
This is why, yeah, words like smart or truth or know are so fraught, because there's different ways of knowing, right? And I think part of why I included contact, and I'm glad you introduced contact as your pushback, Carl, because part of what's so beautiful to me about that ending is that Ellie is, um, yes, she's being humble as a scientist, acknowledging her epistemic kind of like limitations, but she's also like being authentic to an experience that she had, right? And I think that's
Yes.
a crucial part of the ending, is that her putting her foot down and saying, I know it sounds crazy, but this is a thing I experienced, is her way of being true to a thing that's meaningful to her, that she feels she has experienced, right? And she wouldn't even phrase it that way. She would say that she has experienced, right? And that, I think that's a crucial part of the doubt your doubts ethos, is just this um, very valid desire to not discard things that we have experienced that have been meaningful to us, um, because of doubts, because maybe those doubts are on a different epistemic plane than the experience, right? Maybe the experience with God or with faith or with whatever is on this relational level, and the doubts creeping in are on this other level of some other kind of knowledge. And maybe doubting your doubts is less about being obstinate and pushing, and it's more about pivoting to what is this channel of, to use that front word again, truth, right? To which I feel indebted, right? To which I feel relationally bound. And I think that's what's happening to Ellie. And I think that's part of why her doubters, this is part of what I write in the book, is that her doubters, the film implies, are never going to believe her until they have the same experience, right? Which is not necessarily a critique on them, although the film definitely makes them out to be villains and, like, fist shaking, like, we're supposed to root against them, we're supposed to feel as if they are being obstinate. But I think the graceful reading of their bewilderment is that there's no way they could believe her until they've gone through it too. And once they have gone through it, we would hope that they would have the humility to be authentic to what they have gone through. I think that's maybe the more forgiving reading of those antagonists, those epistemic antagonists at the end of the film. Right?
Sure. Which is also why I really like the way Joss Palmer responds when some reporter asks him, "Do you believe her?" and he's like, "Well, what's the phrase he uses? He says, as a person of faith, I'm bound by a different covenant than Dr. Arroway."
Mm-hmm.
And I really love that explicit acknowledgement that like he just thinks in different patterns, and
Yeah.
his life choices and sort of his career and everything thinks
That's
in
a relational way to describe the difference, right? He's saying
yeah.
my relationship to my faith is different than hers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a great line, because then he says, I still believe her, but that itself is a relational because he and her are such good friends. And he's just like, I don't
Yeah.
think she's crazy. I don't have any evidence for that, but and that is useful, especially if we could maybe take these two characters and put them in context of our talking with or encountering or discussing faith crises with people who are encountering them in their own lives. Be more like Matthew McConaughey's character, Joss Palmer, as opposed to the James Wood character, who's you know, just a fish shaking
Yeah.
skeptic. That we would all be served better to be like, I don't fully understand this, but I'm going to believe you, and that works. That'll go a lot better, I think.
Sure.
So one of the things that we talk about, and this is just an underscore of something Chris said, we talk in our group a lot about, if you're open to building or rebuilding your faith, to kind of expand on what you're willing to bring, like, to your epistemic table. What do you find to be an acceptable way to sort of accrue belief or knowledge or truth? And a lot of times, kind of pre-faith crisis, some of us kind of depend mostly on things like authority, and tradition is where we kind of get our knowledge and our belief. Not everybody. There are plenty of people who are much less simplistic than I was. But some people that's kind of where they start. And we encourage people. Yeah, you may have more information now, in terms of your study, your historical study, your theological study, and though that information is useful, we encourage you to bring that to the table, but also be open to witness testimony and personal experience and revelation, and the beauty, like looking for something that is beautiful, that tastes good. And I feel like that's kind of a shift that's represented in Ellie, is the willingness to bring in something that maybe wasn't a way that you relied on for truth before.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So I was going to say we can move on, speaking of skeptics, to method of dealing with faith crisis number 2, which you're going to guess the movie immediately when we say the title. It's called The Red Pill Approach, aka you might call it Lean Into Your Doubts. So obviously, like, the most iconic movie for this is The Matrix. Yeah, I think that is exactly summing up this perspective. Does someone want to kind of give us a summary of how that film encapsulates this approach?
This particular part of the essay, even though overall I think, sort of like Chris, I sort of land on the third option as sort of the one that resonates the most with me. But there was a real moment in my life where I had to switch, where I had to become like Neo. So for those of you who haven't seen the movie, I don't know why you're listening to a podcast on pop culture, but Neo is presented with this choice to figure out what the truth is or not, or to go back and live in his sort of dream world, and he chooses to take the red pill, and that's when he finds out that all of reality is secretly a computer simulation by our robot overlords to keep us all enslaved so they can turn us into human batteries. And everything that you know is just false. You're actually just a human sitting in a vat somewhere with a bunch of wires screwed into the back of your skull.
Mm-hmm.
And once he finds that out, he can't go back. Like you can't go back and get replugged back into the Matrix until the fourth movie, which we shouldn't talk about, but whatever.
That could be its whole episode.
Yeah, right. That could be a whole thing. Although I guess there is the one character from the first Matrix, Cypher, who wants to go back in and sort of sides with the robots. But the epistemological point is, once you know this thing, you can't go back. And in my own faith development, there was a moment where I felt that taking the red pill is sort of the appropriate metaphor here, where I kind of had to realize that the prophets aren't fallible. Sorry, that the prophets are fallible. They're not infallible. And to really confront that, like, was a moment in my personal development that really shifted a lot of the ground underneath me. Not in a faith crisis way, but just in a how do
In a
I
maturing of your faith way, right?
yeah,
Like it moves beyond primary answers, beyond a child's understanding of how the gospel works.
yeah, like I cannot go back to my sort of pre 17 or 18-year-old Carl version. I can't. It's not possible. I've taken the red pill and my faith is in a new place now. And so I really like that, even though when we get to the third one, I'm going to resonate with that more myself. So I hope that's a good explanation of sort of this basic point and the movie that makes it so wonderfully, fantastically. Iconically, absolutely.
But I also like that you brought in the Truman Show analogy, because I feel like that is kind of how some of the people who I've known who've gone through faith crises feel about trying to still participate in the church after having their knowledge changed. Like at the beginning of the film, Truman is happy, his world feels real to him, and everything seems authentic. But after he figures out what's going on, everything feels sinister, even though it's the same thing. Everything feels phony. And there's just this kind of change that the knowledge brings to his experience that sours it, right? And that can happen when you have a faith crisis, that all these things you previously enjoyed are soured by this knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really good point of contrast, because like Carl mentioned Cypher in the Matrix. He's the one example in the Matrix who wants to go back, right? And I mentioned that in the essay as like the film's way of cluing us in that that's the morally inferior choice, right? Because Cypher is a villain, and his desire to go back is seen as this epistemically cowardly thing to do, right? And but like the reason why he wants to go back is pretty relatable. He wants to go back into this world of comfort instead of this nightmarish, like post-apocalyptic, we're all plugged into like holes in the back of our necks and we have to eat oatmeal every day. Like there's something about Cypher's villainy that feels like it's an understandable temptation. Whereas to your point about the Truman Show, it's emotionally impossible for Truman to want what Cypher wants. Once he realizes that people around him are deceiving him, we it would be impossible for us in the audience to relate to him wanting the illusion to continue, right? We inevitably root for he has to get out of this, right? So I think that's a really interesting contrast where both The Matrix and The Truman Show are rooting for the liberation from this kind of like false reality, but they paint slightly different pictures of what that falsehood feels like, whether it feels like a comfort that we can no longer indulge in, or a threatening kind of they live like nightmare of falsehood that even if we wanted to indulge in wouldn't be comforting anymore, right?
Just as an interesting point, I wonder what would have happened to Truman if he had walked outside at the end of the movie and seen a nightmarish post-apocalyptic wasteland. Right. Maybe he'd be like, you know what? I'm going to go back in. That's fine.
Well, and that's what Christoph threatens him will happen, right? He says, once you step through that door, you're going to find worse people than the people I have invented for you, right? You're going to find worse situations. The world out there is much scarier. And there's a sense in which Christoph is right, but he's saying it in such a condescending way that we can't help but root against that warning.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. What happens if he leaves and is disappointed? Even on a less dramatic scale. Like what if 10 years later he regrets it, right? There's something of that I think a lot of people who have been through faith crises can relate to. I think a lot of people I know who relate to this second paradigm, this red pill approach to crisis, who have kind of like leaned into their doubts and found a whole new world, often relate to that melancholic, like, I wish I could be like Cypher and just like go back and taste that steak, because it did feel nice when I thought that these things were true that I no longer can think are true. There is something that people miss, even if it's unfathomable epistemically or emotionally, to go back to it, right?
I would watch the devil out of a Truman Show too, that had a Truman going through a second version of a faith crisis where he wants to go back and is totally having an existential crisis over his life now. That would be
Has
an
to grapple with the
amazing movie.
nuances of a new reality in which the world doesn't revolve around him. Yeah, that would be incredible.
Fascinating movie.
Certainly would. Well, I think this kind of brings us to approach number 3, which a lot of us have said this is kind of our favorite approach. And I think it's because it's a more nuanced approach, right? It's the challenge of nuanced reconciliation is what you call it. And the question is it possible?
Sure.
Anyone have a particular film that they'd like to discuss this perspective from? It's interesting that they're all children's movies. Recent children's movies that you bring up in the essay. So we've got Zootopia, which is interesting because the thing about Zootopia is that it shows that Officer Hops, she's having a hard time because no one believes she can do her job. They're prejudiced against her. But also the fox has prejudice against him from the opposite direction. Everyone is having a hard time.
Yeah.
And that's what I kind of liked about that film for this approach, is that it's not focused on one character, whereas like The Matrix and The Truman Show are very much this one character has been lied to by everybody and they are the only person in it. Whereas Zootopia is much more of a communal narrative where everyone is having a difficult time. Everyone has different perspectives. It's much more true to the reality of society that we are all experiencing different versions of our faith. Like you were saying in the beginning, we all have different experiences with the church, and with doctrine and with history and with our families. And those things affect how our society functions together. And we're constantly negotiating that together and renegotiating how our society works and how our church works.
I like that way of framing the difference between approach 3 and the first two, because the first two really are individualistic, right? As far as the kind of narrative they're describing is everyone lying to me, or is everyone telling the truth to me, right? It's all about me. Whereas the third one is, what is this system? What is this collective to which I belong? And can I continue to belong in it? Can I continue to engage with it in a way that's feasible, right? Obviously, it's still about the individual's ability to do that or not, but the question and the solution, or lack thereof, leans on this collective question, right? This question of what are all the moving parts of what it means to engage with this complexity, to engage with truth and falsity and good and evil, and maybe the institution does help people and the institution does harm people. How do I sit with both of those, right? That's a question that can't be answered on a purely individual level. The way, you can't just be Truman and walk into a door and solve that problem. You have to. This is part. And I guess I'm cutting ahead a little bit, but in the section of the essay where I describe some of the caveats to all of these approaches, one of the caveats to this one is that it can't be done in a community that doesn't support it being done, right? You can't make this kind of nuanced reconciliation if your ward has ostracized you, or if you have been excommunicated, or if your parents have kicked you out of, if your family won't listen, or if they've kicked you out of their home because your orientation or belief or whatever doesn't line up with what they think is right and wrong. Then it becomes much more infeasible, at least I won't say impossible, but it becomes much more difficult, I'd imagine, for this kind of nuanced reconciliation to even sound like a possibility. All that is to say, I'm trying to throw the caveats out here right away because we've all indicated that this is the one towards which we feel a little bit of preference, right? But it also has its messy counterpoints as well, right?
I tried to plug the second one for a bit, but
Sure.
I think it's interesting that all of these movies are so recent as well. Like that's just a sort of cultural commentary that the sort of hyper nuanced, like there everything shades of gray. There aren't really firm villains, sorts of thing. It's, I was
It's a
interesting
much
to me.
newer trend in storytelling,
Yeah,
that's for sure.
very very new. And I think that's interesting, and we'll sort of see how that goes in film culture moving forward. But that's sort of a side note, anyway. Sorry, I think
Well,
Amanda was about
that's
to say
part of
something.
why I picked all those kids films because I think part of what was so moving to me about Zootopia was that it ends with this messiness, and I thought that was really brave to end a children's movie with this like admission of, well, we haven't solved animal metaphor for racism, but we're going to keep trying, and like to just tell your audience that requires a lot of, I think, trust in the audience and the mostly children audience, right? You trust the filmmakers are saying, we trust you to understand that there's not just one bad guy, there's not just one good guy, there's just people doing stuff. Like sometimes we hurt each other, and sometimes the problems that we're trying to address are like really complicated and really systemic and really messy, and can only be addressed if we collectively just do our best. That's like way harder to sell, I think, or way harder to have trust in as a story to tell to children, compared to something like, here's a story about an evil dragon who destroyed everything and then we killed him and it was fine afterwards. Like, um,
Yeah.
I think there's some bravery there to do that, particularly in films have been doing that kind of ending for a very long time, but children's films, I think there's something relatively recent about that kind of bravery to tell children it's messy and we do our best, right?
I think that's a good like transition to Inside Out, which I really liked
Mhm.
as an
Yeah.
example. Toward the beginning of the movie, like Joy, so, well, through most of the movie, Joy sees herself as kind of the superior state of existence. Maybe like anger and anxiety, maybe they might be useful, but never oh, I can't even remember what is the
Sadness.
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 Sadness, yeah. Never
Mm.
sadness. We just is if we can just keep her off in a corner, and then everything will be just fine. And I think that's um there's a quote that I really like from Flannery O'Connor, and she talks about how what people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket when, of course,
Mm.
it's the cross. And that was part of I don't know, one of my, like, I don't know, red pill experiences or whatever, is that realizing that faith is hard, not just because it's a hard thing to do, but also because you will experience disappointment, and maybe that disappointment isn't like a failure on your part to be good enough. Maybe that's just part of the program. Sadness is just it's just part of the experience. um uh Struggles and questions and failures, including of people you who are leaders who you trust. That's part of this kind of life of experience and growing. So I really liked the Inside Out, and her kind of having this experience where she learns to synthesize, like you said, all of the different experiences.
Yeah.
I think you can almost rename the emotions for a faith crisis, right? You'd have faith and you'd have doubt. And then, like, anger against God is definitely a thing.
Yeah.
And, like, you could do these and think about them as all as part of your faith, right? That they all have to work together to form a complete spiritual experience. It's not just, if I don't have this childlike faith, this joy constantly,
Yeah.
then I'm a failure as a religious person. That's not how it's supposed to be. Like, the Psalms are like largely anger at God, like at least half. right? Like this is part of faith. This should be part of faith, and we do tend to simplify it, like Joy does at the beginning of the film. So I think it's a pretty healthy way to talk about it with it Inside Out.
I love that at the end of the movie, the core memories have all become mixtures of the different emotions, and that shows a maturing of Riley, the little girl in whose head all of this is happening. I just that nuance synthesis is the word you used, Amanda. I think that's a great word to describe Joy's character arc in that movie.
Yeah, my bias towards that movie. I mean, when I wrote this essay, I was working in the mental health field, working particularly in like um, therapeutic boarding schools for troubled teenagers with mood disorders and attachment disorders and things. And so watched this film with them on a field trip, just bawled my eyes out because it felt very resonant to the kinds of work that we were doing in group therapy and in, you know, their individual therapy sessions and stuff. And there's something, yeah, I think there's something really beautiful about the synthesis that film reaches at the end, where it's teaching its audience. I said earlier, you know, talking to children, but adults too, right? We're all four of us are adults, seeming to have been moved by
Oh,
this
I
movie,
think
right?
everyone who
There's
I went to that
something,
movie with cried. Every
there's
single
something.
person
It's
in
speaking
that
to
movie.
all of us. It's reminding all of us, yeah, that it's okay to feel all these things, and that it's good to feel all these things, and that the anger and the sadness can be just as important of a part of who you are as Joy. And I like Liz the metaphor you're using of like, what if that's like, what if joy is like faith, what if anger is like anger, what if sadness is like doubts, right? I think a healthy spiritual relationship with one's you know, faith journey involves may involve, if we take this third approach at least, a synthesis of like what all those feelings are speaking to and how all of them are valid at once, or maybe not at once, but at different times and in different ways, and in ways that are equally important to us, right? It's easy to get stuck in one or the other and to demonize everything else. um,
I think this has been a really great discussion. Like I've just really enjoyed this, and I hope you all listening have enjoyed this. I think we're going to close here, but I encourage everybody to just pick up a copy of Mormonism and the Movies. There's so many great essays in there like this that just give some good insights, kind of similar to the work we're trying to do on this podcast of using film to do spiritual things and to think more deeply about our lives. We'll just end with some quick promos of where you can find us. Chris, where can people find your work online or follow you?
The real Chris Wei is my handle on Twitter, Instagram. A bunch of my work is on chrisway.com. So you can go there if you want to see videos or things I've written or whatever. Obviously, the book Mormonism and the Movies is on that website, but also you can just search for it on Amazon.
That's great. Amanda, where can we find you?
I am on Twitter at FreeBaronAmanda. And I contribute to Public Square Magazine occasionally. If you're interested in a faith crisis support group on Facebook and you're looking for something that is faith affirming, but also open to discussing hard issues, you can find our group. It's called Uplift Community of Faith, and you can just go to facebook.com/groups/uplift COF.
Fantastic. And Carl?
I'm on Twitter at Carl Cranny, who welcome to come and comment and try to have conversations there. I've been enjoying it more than I expected to, so we'll see how long that lasts. Especially after President Nelson this week was like, the first thing you need to do, or sorry, it was President Oaks, one of the things you need to do to avoid contention is not be in contentious places. And I'm like, well, everybody should just delete their Twitter accounts right now.
There's no contention on Twitter, is there?
What?
No. But if you do follow Carl on Twitter, you can appreciate his lovely live blogs of Under the Banner of Heaven. It's pretty hilarious. So highly
Oh,
enjoyable.
yeah, we should do another hour real quick about that show for sure.
Oh no, we're going to. We're going there in a few
Oh,
weeks
good.
when it's all out.
When it's all
And you
over.
can
I'll
find
listen.
my writing on lizbusby.com and links to all my social media on there. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.